The 80-20 Principle, and 92 Other Powerful Laws of Nature by Richard Koch. Preface to the new edition. I am sometimes asked to write a new book on the future of business, but I always reply the same way. I have already written the book. It is the one that you're listening to now. The late Peter Drucker always used to say that the future was already here, its seeds evident in the present. I think about this another way. I see a new paradigm of business struggling to emerge from the husk of the old. Using the word paradigm risks seeming overblown. But there is no other word to describe the magnitude of the change, because it is both theoretical in the best sense and also intensely practical. The raw material for the new paradigm lies in the body of this book, the most powerful ideas derived from science. There are no fewer than 92 scientific laws or principles that fit all of the following criteria. 1. They are accurate observations, hypotheses, or laws that frequently or always apply. 2. They are not obvious and are often counterintuitive. 3. They are of great value in business, careers, and/or our personal lives. 4. They are not as well known as they should be, and not used anywhere near as often as they should be. And 5. They have hidden depth and are worth exploring beyond their surface value. The key elements of the new approach are clearly visible, although they are at odds with prevailing practice, such as 1. Work is about insight, not hours put in. Wealth creation is 1% perspiration and 99% inspiration. Intuition is more important than rational analysis. 2. Business is driven by ideas and information. The best ideas create the most money. The best ideas are infinitely recyclable. 3. What is key is not management or finance or clever strategies. It is the product. Nothing is more important than improving or reimagining the product and developing a unique new business system to support it. 4. Less is more. Businesses make breakthroughs when they subtract enough, when everything is taken away except the core. In theory, this is easy, but in practice, it is rarely done. When it is done, the result is a landmark product. The printing press, bicycle, Model T Ford, aspirin, Coca-Cola, television, McDonald's, Disneyland, microchip, personal computer, internet, smartphone, iPod, that shapes the future. 5. Innovation and natural selection create the vast majority of new value in any economy. 6. Walled gardens create fortunes for a decade or so. Open networks create fortunes forever. And finally, 7. Only exponential growth creates interesting new markets and fortunes. Exponential growth usually comes from simplifying a product, market, or business system that has great sophistication but too little simplicity. The overall answer is in the final chapter, which draws all the ideas together. If you are the sort of impatient person, like me, who wants the answer quickly, you might want to listen to that chapter before you start the rest. Make the most of the feast of ideas in front of you. Create something new, unique, and indelibly yours from the luxuriant diversity of our intellectual heritage. You will never again think that your life and work are unimportant. Richard Koch, Gibraltar, January 2014. Overture. on appreciating a wonky world. You don't see something until you have the right metaphor to let you perceive it. Thomas Kuhn. In Search of a Few Universal Principles. The prize-winning biologist and author Edwin O. Wilson defines science as the organized, systematic enterprise that gathers knowledge about the world and condenses the knowledge into testable laws and principles. Science presents us with a few universal patterns of how things really work, rules and relationships that contain tremendous insight, not just within specific scientific disciplines, but also outside them, in business and life generally. There is a surprisingly small number of these simple, recurrent explanations for complex and apparently unrelated phenomena. Nature, it has been well said, is prodigal with details, but parsimonious with principles. I have tried to identify the most important and relevant of these patterns, rules, and relationships, which I have called power laws. I should make it clear that I am using power law in a colloquial sense, and not in the technical, mathematical sense, where a power law is a quantitative relationship expressed in an equation. My power laws have to justify 3 criteria for inclusion here. They are: 1. The power law must be a coherent theory of how things work, with wide acceptance among scientists. 2. The power law must transcend the discipline where it originated, and be used in more than one scientific discipline. And 3. The power law must be capable of application in business. I have ranged far and wide in the hunt for useful power laws. Part 1 includes not just Darwin's theory, modern genetics, and neo-Darwinist theories, but also power laws from evolutionary psychology, conventional psychology, archaeology, paleontology, anthropology, ecology, neuroplasticity, and game theory. Part 2 draws on Newtonian physics and the mechanical view of science, on Einstein's theories of relativity, on quantum mechanics, and on mathematics, logic, and philosophy. Part 3 examines systems theory, chaos, complexity, and economics, appropriating en route some ideas from cybernetics, probability theory, geology, sociology, epidemiology, history, and from some of the disciplines used earlier, especially mathematics. Although I have not ignored the humanities, there is a strong bias toward the natural and physical sciences. I have avoided well-trolled areas such as the insights into managing people available from industrial psychology, and sought fresh perspectives not currently available in management literature. I have generally avoided management concepts, even where these claim, usually spuriously, some scientific validity. I have also tried, I am sure not wholly successfully, to avoid facile comparisons. There is nothing worse than half-baked business conclusions drawn from quarter-understood scientific ideas. One example of what I mean is the abuse by certain management writers of quantum mechanics, the 20th century revolution in physics, which is probably the greatest triumph of science in that century. Revelations about how microscopic, inanimate particles behave have been made the foundation for all kinds of theories about how organizations and society should be organized, in many cases with absolutely no justification in quantum mechanics. Some of these theories are sensible, some wacky, but the link with science is tenuous at best. Another example of woolly thinking is the common parallel drawn between evolution by natural selection and the nature of competition between established corporations. This parallel is simply wrong, betraying a profound lack of understanding of both what Darwin said and how modern business competition works. And yet, if Darwin is read carefully and sympathetically, there are some wonderful insights into how business works. My researcher, Andrei Mahachik, and I looked at over 1,000 scientific theories and principles which, on first inspection, appeared possibly relevant before winnowing down the list to 93 power laws. We have allowed into our list not only theories well supported by data, but also empirically observed facts, and a few non-verifiable but resonant concepts. We have included a handful of ideas that offer insight without having any scientific validity, such as Murphy's and Parkinson's laws. The vast majority of the power laws, however, are scientifically respectable, and where they are controversial, attention is drawn to this. Insight from science or business success. Science is an attempt to explain the world around us. Business is part of this world. Physicists know that the universe is unitary. That is, the same laws apply everywhere all the time. Scientists working in different disciplines have been helped by theories developed elsewhere. What works in biology also works in economics, in physics, and in psychology, and the other way round. Interdisciplinary sciences such as chaos and complexity observe the same phenomena and the same patterns, equally relevant to meteorology, or financial markets, or geology, or physics, or chemistry, or many other disciplines, and usually capable of similar mathematical expression across all these areas. The reason that insights and theories from one science work in another is that the universe is more fundamental than our scientific taxonomy. In trying to understand and study things, we break them down. But all we are doing is glimpsing from different angles the same truly universal principles. My quest has been for power laws that transcend scientific boundaries and defy artificial barriers erected between science and business. So in trying to gain insight from science, I have first tried to understand the science properly, in its own terms, before applying it to business. This is exactly what a chemist does, for example, in seeking to understand and apply an idea from physics. The progress from order to chaos. 19th century science was solid and dependable. 20th century science was surreal, often incomprehensible, and pretty incredible. At the start of the 21st century, most of us feel more at home with the scientific view of the late 19th century, and we run our lives accordingly. The 19th century view of science was the culmination of 3 centuries of progressively increasing degrees of understanding and confidence. Educated people felt that they understood how the world worked, and that there would soon be few limits to humanity's dominion over nature. A whole new scientific civilization beckoned. The 20th century bit back. As scientists learned more, the universe seemed less predictable, less orderly, more mysterious, and more frightening. Defense mechanisms set in. Brilliant scientists like Albert Einstein reached for their blinkers. The universe just couldn't be that random, that pointless, that out of sync with reason. And so began an intellectual reaction that is still with us. Most of our mental models are still those of 19th century science. It's more comfortable that way. Arguably, we're also more productive with those models. Let's see how the world became so much easier to understand from the 16th to the 19th centuries, and how much more difficult thereafter. In praise of the incomparable Mr. Newton. Perhaps the most important science book ever. Sir Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, was published in 1687. Newton drew together knowledge that had been simmering for centuries and was then coming to the boil. From the ancient Greeks, from Roger Bacon, a late 13th century Oxford scholar, from Leonardo da Vinci, Galileo, Kepler, from French philosopher René Descartes, and from many other sources. Newton was both the father of modern empirical science and the codifier of the most powerful intellectual framework the world has ever seen, the idea of the clockwork universe. The Newtonian world was simple and easily understood. Everything could be related to everything else, on Earth and in the heavens. Reality comprised machines and parts of machines, all behaving in accordance with a few basic, universal, reliable laws. Science as a total system made sense. God was relegated to the role of wise clockmaker, the chap who wound up the clock, the universe, and then left it to operate on its own according to certain standard operating procedures. You can see the clockwork universe manifested in the work of Adam Smith and all the classical economists, in Thomas Robert Malthus's thoughts on population and sustainability, and the ideas of the French Enlightenment on the perfectibility of man, an idea encapsulated by British historian Edward Gibbon, who wrote in 1776 that we cannot be certain to what heights the human species may aspire. In Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, in Sigmund Freud's mechanical model of the mind and the consciousness, and in all political and social writers, from Thomas Hobbes to Karl Marx, John Stuart Mill, Auguste Comte, Vilfredo Pareto, and Max Weber. Although many of these thinkers added a teleological or dialectical perspective, which is at odds with a simple, static clockwork world, their views are all mechanistic and rational. Everything is a machine. Everything obeys simple laws. Everything fits together. Everything can be understood. And everything can be analyzed and reduced to its basic elements. Everything works and has a purpose. People can aspire to control the world, society, and their own nature because everything is mechanical, and intelligence can control mechanical things. The Newtonian ideology gave people such confidence that they could understand and control the world that this is what they did. The explosion of science, industry, technology, and wealth that followed in the next 300 years, which was well beyond any historical precedent and which took us to the brink of material utopia, would have been impossible without faith in the clockwork universe. It is therefore difficult to overstate Newton's impact on business. One route of influence is directly through engineering and machinery, and the productivity revolutions from 1750 to 2000. Another is through the influence of mechanical models on economics and the way that organizations, a modern word but a very Newtonian concept, are structured. A third is through the power of analysis, the contribution of numbers, accounting systems, calculators, and computers, all of which depend on Newtonian methods. Nearly all executives and management writers inhabit Newton's world, and with good reason. Yet science has moved on. Weird and wonderful 20th century science. Danish physicist Niels Bohr, 1885 to 1962, was one of the great brains of the 20th century, and perhaps the most important developer of quantum physics, which must rank as one of the most sublime and counterintuitive scientific theories of all time. Bohr used to tell a story about a Jewish theological student who attended 3 lectures by a famous rabbi. The first lecture was splendid, and the student understood it all. The second lecture was even better. The rabbi clearly understood every word, but it was so subtle and deep that the student couldn't follow it at all. The third lecture, though, was the crowning achievement. It was so brilliant that even the rabbi couldn't understand it. Bohr said that quantum theory was weird. It made him feel like the rabbi at the third lecture. Quantum theory is so subversive that even Albert Einstein kept trying to prove it wrong. As we'll see in Chapter 8, the micro-world of atoms chooses which state to leap into entirely at random. The precise positions or velocities of electrons cannot be measured. Light is both like a wave and like a particle. Nothing is real, nothing is predictable, everything is uncertain, and everything is related, mysteriously, to everything else. The first 2 decades of the 20th century also gave us Einstein's theories of relativity, which are extraordinarily difficult to understand. Einstein himself said that only 12 people in the world would understand his general theory. As a result of relativity, we know that space is curved. Gravitation is the warping of space and time by physical mass. Time and space are not 2 dimensions, but one linked frame of reference. Time is part of the physical universe. The scientific theme that there is no objective reality was reinforced in 1931 by the brilliant Austrian scientist Kurt Gödel, who was eccentric to the point of madness. Nonetheless, his incompleteness theorem proved beyond doubt that, even within a simple formal system like mathematics, you could write down statements that could never be either proved or disproved within the terms of that system. Reality is an invention, not a given. So, farewell absolute truth. Systems thinking and the developments in chaos and complexity in the last third of the 20th century took us even further back to the future. It turns out that most things in the world, and certainly some of the most important, including the weather, the brain, cities, economies, history, and people, are nonlinear systems, which means that they don't behave in the straightforward way assumed by all scientists from Isaac Newton to the end of the 19th century. Nonlinear systems don't have simple causes and effects. They don't behave like mechanical objects. Everything is interrelated. Equilibrium is elusive and fleeting. Small and even trivial causes can have massive effects. Control is impossible. Prediction is hazardous. Simple systems can demonstrate incredibly complex behavior, and complex systems can give rise to very simple behavior. In this weird and wonky world, intelligence, common sense, and good intentions are no guarantee of good results. Instead, unwelcome and unintended consequences are endemic. This is a topsy-turvy world where classical Newtonian cause and effect logic can get you into a lot of trouble. Yet, scientists have discovered remarkably consistent laws and patterns that can describe chaotic behavior. Although they take some teasing out, beauty, method, and order do exist within the apparent madness and disorder. A new gestalt for business? Fear not, help is at hand. If we understand the world revealed by modern science, we can stop being slaves to defunct physicists, philosophers and economists, and to dysfunctional genes. We will understand, for instance, why individuals are badly programmed to work effectively in large organizations, and why, for good and ill, organizations have a will of their own. A slight but crucial change in perspective will demonstrate that the fundamental unit of value in business is economic information, that the market in economic information is highly imperfect, allowing us to appropriate huge value, that technology drives growth, and that entrepreneurs, rather than scientists, are the main drivers of technology. We'll see that a struggle for existence is at the heart of business, but that the struggle is primarily between ideas, not between corporations. That corporate competition is marginal to our economies and to our personal success, and that business is not at all like war. The power laws tell us that innovation is mandatory but also predictable, following a seamless process of variation, frequent failure, infrequent success, and further variation, a process eerily reminiscent of natural selection. That most experiments have to fail, and yet that experimentation is essential, and that business is not generally structured for experimentation, wrongly preferring the architecture of the cathedral to that of the bazaar. A new gestalt holds that growth is not difficult to find, but is extremely difficult to perpetuate in one vehicle. That less is more, that influence is generally superior to control, and that we are moving into an era where return on management effort, known by the acronym ROME, is more important than return on capital employed, known by the acronym ROCE, and where corporate ownership has more downside than upside. The new science explains that most of business is nonlinear and unpredictable, yet that different branches of business each follow discernible and distinctive patterns. That there are always a few powerful forces that we can use to our advantage or that will upset our plans, and that success usually emerges when we are looking the other way, but that unexpected successes, if we deign to notice them, can then be deliberately nurtured into explosive bonanzas. We'll see that business often obtains diminishing returns from extra effort and investment, while the most important economic phenomenon at the start of the 21st century is increasing returns, where additional investment and command of intellectual property throw off exponentially increasing cash. We'll learn that either-or thinking is a trap, that trade-offs can be elided, and that a both-and attitude is the handmaiden of creativity. That there is an infinite number of ways to fail, but there are always some multiple routes to success. And that the opposite of a great business truth is another great business truth. Finally, the power laws reveal that business is a book of bets, that only skillful gamblers can consistently win. Yet that business is also a series of related transactions, linked together by cooperation, loyalty, networks, serial reciprocity, and reputation, and that the richest results and the satisfaction of our own selfish ends require us to forego our own short-term self-interest in order to cooperate with the best cooperators. It is not the meek who shall inherit the earth, nor the aggressive, but rather the cooperative. These are not random opinions or tentative interpretations of science, nor are they wild extrapolations from it. They are well-grounded inferences from scientific theory and from the observation of business within the rather novel framework that the power laws donate to it. This framework is superior because it fits both dominant scientific insights and business reality, and because it prescribes a set of actions that work, that lead to success. A final key advantage of the new framework is that it can also accommodate the traditional mechanical view of science and business, which, after all, has proved its worth. The old regime has its place. It is important to take a balanced view of the changes in science in the 20th century and of the appropriate response of business to these changes. If by some impossible trick we had only 20th century science and nothing from the Newtonian heritage, we would all be incomparably poorer in the depth and power of our thinking and in our wealth. Newton's science would have been enough to send men to the moon and back, and for most practical purposes, the inaccuracies in his physics can be safely ignored. It is true that tiny, inanimate particles don't behave at all in a Newtonian way, but this doesn't stop us building bridges as we did in the days before quantum theory. Logic may tell us that truth is always elusive and subjective, but we don't and shouldn't behave in our daily lives as though there were no difference between truth and lies. A world whose science was confined to relativity, quantum theory, modern genetics, systems theory, and chaos and complexity theory would be a strange, inhospitable place. Earth might resemble Douglas Adams' appalling planet where they put all the highly paid people, like management consultants and spin doctors and politicians, who couldn't actually do anything. We need the old stuff in science. We need engineers and chemists and old-style physicists and doctors. We need mechanistic thinking, analysis, and faith in reason. And we need these things in business, too. We need our balance sheets and budgets, our old-fashioned management by objectives, our planning and monitoring, and our faith, illusory or otherwise, in our ability to control our own fate. The new scientific view has the merit of greater accuracy and understanding of how the universe works. If it is a less appealing view, on the face of it, that is no reason to behave like ostriches. But there is a downside to understanding. It can paralyze. It can make us give up before we start. The great thing about Newtonian science was that it was activist and optimistic. It drove, and drives, huge numbers of ordinary people to achieve extraordinary results. Control was the watchword. The universe could be understood, and it could be controlled. We know now that control is not possible. The universe has a mind of its own, and will defeat our attempts to order and subdue it. And yet it's still important to try. Fatalism, or excessive laissez-faire, will not lead to what we want. A sophisticated anti-Newtonian philosophy is of much less use than a primitive Newtonian one. Let me illustrate this by jumping ahead to one of the concepts to emerge from complexity theory: self-organization. The theory reveals that a stunning and irrefutable tendency of complex systems, like cities or economies or human bodies, to organize themselves from a number of simpler parts and earlier stages. They do this according to certain typical patterns that are repeated, with minor variations, over and over again. It is undeniable that a business organization is a similar sort of entity. It is a self-organizing system. The simplistic, modernist prescription might therefore be that we should leave organizations to organize themselves. And there is much in this. Anyone who has tried to organize a team from a preordained plan, with prescribed roles for each team member, knows the limitations of this approach. It's far better to tell the team what to do and let the team members work out their own roles and how to do it. Yet the extrapolation of this liberal approach to a whole organization, on the implicit grounds that if this is how nature arranges things, this is how we should do it too, is deeply flawed. If it is left alone, the organization will organize itself effectively for its own ends. It won't do what its owners or leaders want it to do. nor will it be functional from society's viewpoint. The self-organizing organization will end up larger and fatter than it needs to be to achieve any given economic objective. This criticism, it is true, comes from an old-fashioned Newtonian mechanistic view of the world. It is part of an ideology of control and rational objectives. But if I am accused of harboring this ideology, I gladly plead guilty. The ideology of control and objectives is one price of progress. Escaping obsolete mental models. Scientists working with relativity, or quantum theory, or modern mathematics, or systems theory, or chaos, or complexity are at the top of their fields. They may not reach absolute truth, but they are closer to knowing what happens, and to a large extent how and why. But what about the rest of us, trying to pilot our way through life in general and our business affairs in particular? We're sitting ducks. We're bound to misunderstand what is happening, to see most of our efforts lead nowhere much, to pull levers that don't work, and to do things that may lead precisely to the outcomes we most want to avoid. We work in the 21st century world using 19th century mental models and probably governed by genes that have not changed essentially since the Stone Age. Yet, there is a way out. If we understand a handful of power laws and if we act to exploit those laws, we can multiply our effectiveness. The power laws of the universe are like the winds. If we're sailing, we have to use the winds because there is no other source of power on a yacht. But a good sailor doesn't allow the wind to blow her off course. Even against a headwind, she makes progress. She has a map. She has an objective, which is different from that of the winds. She tacks and turns, following a zigzag course that, however tortuous and slow, will bring her safely to port. We have no other sources of power than those provided by the universe, our brains and instincts included. We need to understand the power laws, whether these control tiny particles, huge planets, or our own behavior. But we don't then simply say, "Great, groovy, baby." We respect the laws. We recognize when they can undo our plans. We harness their power in creative ways. But we don't slavishly obey the laws or worship them. We have our own inner light, guiding our faltering steps even as we understand how difficult it is to overcome our programming. We need a good dose of Newtonian mechanics, Cartesian faith in reason, Gibbonian faith in the perfectibility of man, Darwinian faith in evolution, Marxian faith in our ability to arrange society, and Freudian belief in our ability to control our emotions. All faiths that are intellectually untenable, at least in their extreme forms, while simultaneously understanding and using the weirder and subtler reaches of more recent knowledge. On with the show. Part 1. The Biological Laws. How Economic Information Drives Progress. Introduction to Part 1. Part 1 relates to insights from biology and related disciplines, how life originates, how it is structured, and how it develops and adapts to the conditions around it. Its focus is on the evolution of life with particular attention to human life and the relationship between human evolution and business. Chapter 1 examines Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, which we have come to take for granted, but which is the most amazing, awesome, and counterintuitive way that could be imagined for generating life of ever greater beauty and complexity. Chapter 2 constructs the theory of business genes, where economic information evolves by selection and where replicators, the business genes, seek vehicles for their survival and proliferation. Chapter 3 looks at ecological niches and the experiments on small organisms by Soviet scientist G.F. Gauss in the 1930s. Gauss's laws reinforce the importance of differentiation for business genes and their vehicles. Chapter 4 covers evolutionary psychology and the mismatch between our primitive genes and the requirements of modern business. Punctuated equilibrium, a key power law discussed at length in Chapter 11, is also introduced here. And Chapter 5 develops a theory of human cooperation and competition, based on insights from the prisoner's dilemma, other concepts from game theory, and from biology, economics, and anthropology. Selfish objectives, it transpires, can only be met by ever greater degrees of cooperation and interdependence. Chapter 1. On Evolution by Natural Selection. If I could give an award for the best idea ever, I would give it to Darwin, because his idea unites in a stroke these two completely disparate worlds, until then, of the meaningless mechanical physical sciences, astronomy, physics, and chemistry on the one side, and the world of meaning, culture, art, and biology. Daniel Dennett. The universe is run by selection. In the material world, nothing is more important than evolution by natural selection. Without natural selection, our species could not exist. If selection did not apply to ideas, technologies, markets, companies, teams, and products in precisely the same way as it applies to species, we would all be working on the land struggling to avoid malnutrition and famine. Selection drives all material progress. The origins of Darwinism. I love the story of how the idea of natural selection came to light almost as much as I love the idea itself. In the 1830s, both during his long trip around the world and when back in England, Darwin observed the behavior of animals that favored the survival of themselves and their offspring. For example, when in the Galapagos archipelago in the South Pacific in 1835, Darwin noted that a certain white bird would calmly sit by while the first of its hatchlings killed the second. Why did the bird not intervene? Or if she wanted only one hatchling, why bother to lay more than one egg? Repeated observation gave Darwin the answer. He determined that a single egg gave only a 50% survival rate, survival being defined as that of at least one hatchling. That 2 eggs raised the survival rate to 70%, but that 3 eggs brought the survival rate below 50%. Further, if there were 2 live hatchlings, the probability of one of them surviving was lower than if there was only one hatchling. Hence, the mother's apparently perverse behavior was actually conducive to the survival of her family. Darwin combined reflections from his field research with 2 ideas that had been around for many decades in different academic disciplines and fused them together with explosive effect. The 2 ideas were competition and evolution. Darwin first thought of natural selection in 1838 while reading Thomas Robert Malthus's Essay on Population, a dire prophecy of the effects of competition between individuals for food. Malthus, in turn, had been influenced by Adam Smith's theories of economic competition in his book, The Wealth of Nations, the first volume of which had been published in 1776. Smith's thinking had been influenced by a writer another century or so earlier, namely the political philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who had, in 1651, described society as the war of all against all. So the idea of competition was common currency among intellectuals some 200 years before Darwin published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. The idea of evolution had also been widely mooted in the early 19th century. Fossils showed that species had evolved from earlier, more primitive species. K. E. von Baer, 1792 to 1876, encapsulated a major insight when he stated that less general characters are developed from the most general until the most specialized appear. Evolutionists talk about heterogeneity emerging from homogeneity. What no one before Darwin had explained satisfactorily was how evolution worked. Natural selection, a simple but subtle theory. Darwin's theory of natural selection is elegant and extremely economical, resting on three plain observations. First, creatures systematically overproduce their young. There is no exception to the rule, Darwin states, that every organic being naturally increases at so high a rate that if not destroyed, the earth would soon be covered by the progeny of a single pair. He observes that cod produce millions of eggs. If they all survived, the oceans would be solid cod within 6 months. Elephants are the slowest breeders of all known animals, yet within 5 centuries, if unchecked, there would be alive 15 million elephants, descended from the first pair. Survival is a numbers game, with the odds stacked against most creatures. A struggle for existence, Darwin concludes, inevitably follows from the high rate at which all organic beings tend to increase. Second, all creatures vary. We are all unique. Third, the sum of that variation is inherited. We are more like our parents than we are like other people's parents. Darwin put these three obvious facts together to derive the rudiments of natural selection. Competition among siblings means that only a few can survive. As Darwin wrote with feeling in On the Origin, all organic beings are exposed to severe competition. Nothing is easier to admit in words the truth of the universal struggle for life, or more difficult, at least I have found it so, than constantly to bear this conclusion in mind. Yet unless it be thoroughly ingrained in the mind, I am convinced that the whole economy of nature, with every fact on distribution, rarity, abundance, extinction, and variation, will be dimly seen or quite misunderstood. Which individual plants and animals will survive? Clearly those that exploit or fit in best with what Darwin called the conditions of life. In the introduction to On the Origin, he lays out his thesis and acknowledges his debt to Malthus. Darwin comments that he will start by looking at the variation of species, both when domesticated and in nature. He writes, "We shall discuss what circumstances are most favorable to variation. In the next chapter, the struggle for existence amongst all organic beings throughout the world, which inevitably follows from their high geometrical powers of increase, will be treated of. This is the doctrine of Malthus, applied to the whole animal and vegetable kingdoms. As many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as, consequently, there is a frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary however slightly in any manner profitable to itself, will have a better chance of survival, and thus be naturally selected. From the strong principle of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form." Darwin coined the phrase natural selection and explains it very simply. This preservation of favorable variations and the rejection of injurious variations I call natural selection. Plants and animals that have been naturally selected will have had the most successful parents, those who in turn had survived and came from a long line of survivors, and in turn will have more offspring than other organisms. So in each generation there is improvement, driven by the natural selection of the survivors and by the relative reproductive success in that generation of the survivors. He writes, "The slightest advantage in one being over those with which it comes into competition, or better adaptation in however slight a degree to the surrounding physical conditions, will turn the balance." Darwin keeps hammering home his point that natural selection depends on variation. When the conditions of life, such as climate, change, he says, this would manifestly be favorable to natural selection by giving a better chance of profitable variations occurring. And unless profitable variations do occur, natural selection can do nothing. For most of Darwin's contemporaries, the really controversial aspect of On the Origin was not the original part, natural selection, but rather the support that Darwin gave to the general idea of evolution, and especially humanity's descent from animal species. But Darwin's big idea was natural selection. Although he collected, rather inconclusive, data between 1838 and 1859, his main contribution was the flash of insight that he had in 1838, that there was competition for life between individuals and that traits were conserved through their relative adaptability to life's conditions. Natural selection, the key to life. The process is very simple. Variation, then selection, then further variation. Then more variation, more selection, more variation, and so on, back to the start of life and forward to eternity. This is how species evolve. Variation leads to better adaptation. Intrinsic to improved congruence with the conditions of life, therefore, is variation. If there were no differences between parents, there would be no differences between offspring. If there were no differences, even between the offspring of the same parents, there would be no basis for differential success. And success is fitting the conditions of life. There will thus be a continual process of improvement or better adaptation to the environment, although, of course, the environment may change, producing different winners and losers. Variations and improvements occur continually within species, but occasionally a mutation occurs when an individual has a new characteristic. This mutation may improve or worsen the odds of survival. If the latter, the mutation will die out. If the former, the individual mutant will prosper and leave plenty of offspring, who will inherit and pass on the advantage. Over time, therefore, most species will evolve positively, and they will respond to any change that the environment brings. When conditions change, new characteristics are required and encouraged. For 80 years, scientists have studied intensively one plot of land in the desert in the southwestern United States, photographing its changes in response to climate. They have found that variation is the key to growth. Ecologist Tony Burgess explains, "If conditions are variant, the mixture of species increases by 2 to 3 orders of magnitude, that is, 20 to 30 times. If you have a constant pattern, the beautiful desert ecology will almost always collapse into something simpler." Diversity leads to efficient use of resources. Darwin suggested that the more species there were on a piece of land, the more efficiently the land would be used. A number of recent experiments have confirmed his hypothesis. For example, research reported in 1984 on 147 plots of Minnesota prairie demonstrated that the greater the number of species in a plot, the more biomass the plot produced, and also the more nitrogen the soil produced. With fewer species, nitrogen leached out of the soil and was wasted. If a species is diverse, it can survive and prosper. If a species is homogeneous, it is vulnerable. Take hatchery salmon. In the Pacific Northwest of America, where wild salmon were disappearing, scientists bred huge numbers of hatchery salmon and pushed them into the rivers. But these hatchery salmon had little diversity. They were vulnerable to a slight change in the ecosystem. Too many riverside trees had been cut down for logs. Result? Less shade, and therefore a slight rise in river temperatures. Further result? An increase in certain diseases that couldn't flourish in colder water. Final result? The hatchery salmon nearly all died from disease. On reflection, the scientists realized that lack of diversity was the root problem. Had the salmon been gradually interbred, allowing mixing and mutation, a diverse adult population would have contained some salmon resistant to the new diseases. The same applies to computers. More than 9 out of 10 computers today, like the one I'm working on, have the Windows operating system. These computers have the same core internal components, and every computer with Microsoft software is vulnerable to the same computer viruses. I don't think it is fanciful to see the same process at work in cities. For example, in 1950s Britain, government mass-produced housing for poorer people. Municipal councils built massive tower blocks, all the same shape and pattern, oblong, high, undifferentiated, with all the individual dwellings looking identical. Result? Misery, alienation, crime. Something rather similar, although this time produced by private enterprise, was damned by Pete Seeger's song, Little Boxes, where they're all made out of ticky-tacky, and they all look just the same. Jane Jacobs shows in her fascinating book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, that when street lengths, building shapes, sizes, ages, and areas within cities are more diverse, then the cities are not only more beautiful, but also more energetic and wealthier. Diversity works. It always leads to even greater diversity and to sustainable growth. If we want to sum up the theory of evolution by natural selection in 2 words, which have great relevance for all societies and businesses, we should simply remember, diversity works.